Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering the tragic case of Hannah Clarke and her 3 children. So this case is no different from any other case that I've covered on this podcast in the sense that it's horrible and tragic and senseless. But in the same breath, this case is also unlike anything we've ever covered before. So strap in for this ride because it's a tragic roller coaster of emotions and feelings, and it's awful. Now, before I say let's get it, let me remind you that leaving a 5-star review or rating on whichever platform you use to listen to the podcast on really helps the show to grow and to reach a larger audience. I also want to throw out the reminder that the Patreon family has been popping off here lately. We've had a good bit of new people sign up and join the family, and a few perks of Patreon are that you'll get free stickers, along with the weekly episodes that are already included, but they're ad-free. You also get 2 extra episodes a month, so a bonus episode every other Friday. If that's something you're interested in, then there's a link below every episode that you can use that'll take you to Patreon so you can sign up. So if you could take a minute to rate the show, that would be greatly appreciated, and if you want to join the Patreon family, then we'd love to have you. Now, with that out of the way, and without further ado, let's get it. On September 8th, 1988, Hannah Clarke was born to her parents Sue and Lloyd Clarke in Brisbane, Australia. So, this is another case that's outside of the US, which is always interesting to research cases that happen outside of the US, just because of the different verbiage and words used within the research, but we'll get through it. So, Hannah wasn't the only child that Sue and Lloyd Clarke had together, though. She also had a younger brother named Nathaniel, who she was extremely close with. Hannah was always super athletic and well-liked. She was a good student and a good kid. She never met a stranger, and she just seemed to be like the kind of person who could be friends with anybody. So once Hannah made it to college, she was still thriving. She was extremely well-liked by her peers, classmates, and the new people that she met. So much so that she was actually named school captain in college. And from what I could tell, a school captain is essentially the same thing as what we would call a class president, which is impressive for a new college student. And even in college, Hannah remained super active. Fitness and exercise were just a really big part of Hannah's day-to-day life. Which I'm kind of jealous of because who actually likes to exercise? I mean, not me, but the people that do love it for absolutely no reason than that they just love to exercise. Not gonna lie, I kind of envy them. But Hannah participated in CrossFit and she was really big on going to the gym. And it was at the gym that Hannah met a man who would later go on to become her husband. She'd met a man by the name of Rowan Baxter. And I usually love the name Rowan, but this Rowan, oh, we hate him. And that'll make sense soon enough. 31-year-old Rowan was originally from New Zealand, where he'd been a professional rugby player. So obviously fitness and exercise were really big parts of Rowan's life too, which is a major common interest that the couple both shared. But there were a few things that Hannah would go on to learn about Rowan. For starters, he had been married once before, and secondly, he also had a son with his first wife. And it was a little unclear to me as to how it happened, but somehow Rowan, his first wife, and their son had all moved from New Zealand to Australia, which is where Rowan would later end up meeting Hannah at the gym. So let me just interject here for a second just to say that Hannah was 20 years old when she and Rowan met, and Rowan was 31 and divorced with a kid. And even though Rowan and his first wife were divorced, he still lived in the same house as his first wife and his son when he and Hannah were dating. And I'm not real sure how a lot of people would feel about that, but I can see why it would bother some people. Hannah and Rowan had started out initially as friends, but it wasn't long before Hannah was swooning over Rowan and the feelings were mutual. Rowan seemed to be falling for Hannah too. But when Hannah brought her new love interest up to her parents, they weren't really thrilled finding out that Rowan was divorced with a young son. They also didn't love the fact that Rowan was more than a decade older than Hannah. And I've kind of spoken on how I feel about age gaps relationships before, and I usually don't see much of a problem with it, but when there's such a drastic difference in the age gap as to where we are in life, that's when it seems kind of weird. Like, where most 20-year-olds are in life and where most 30-year-olds are in life, it's just hard for me to think that they're both on the same level as far as where they are in life and what they want out of life. Like, Rowan had been through a marriage, the birth of a child, and a divorce, along with probably a mortgage, a few heartbreaks, and a good bit of hard life lessons, all before Hannah had ever started college. But as per usual, that's none of my business, so let's move on. So Hannah's parents weren't thrilled with her falling for Rowan, but they also wanted to support their daughter and not push her away from them and closer to Rowan. So they decided that everyone deserves at least one chance, and they were going to give Rowan that chance for the sake of Hannah being happy. And Rowan did end up growing on Hannah's parents and her family, and Hannah's parents later recall how gradually over time, Rowan had won them over entirely. At least at first. So it was no surprise when Rowan proposed to Hannah in 2011. And it was in Kingscliff, New South Wales, Australia on October of 2012 that Rowan and a newly pregnant Hannah were married. Hannah's family say that Hannah had told everyone that she'd felt like a real-life princess during their wedding service. And their wedding pictures are absolutely stunning. They look like something straight out of a bridal magazine, and you can just see how happy they both were. There was nothing at all at this time that would have indicated how tragically this marriage would end. Even though there were already a few red flags waving around in the background, because Hannah's parents did later recall how the couple had had a wishing well at their wedding, and how Rowan complained and whined about not being gifted enough money by the people that he deemed were financially well off. Hannah's mom even recalled this memory quoting what Rowan had said about it, and what he'd said was, quote, "These people have got a shitload of money, why haven't they given us more?" Which is crazy to me just for the simple fact that that's not how that works at all, firstly, and secondly, be grateful that they gave you anything at all, because gifts and money are not a requirement at a wedding ceremony. It's just people giving you what they can afford or however much they choose to spare. It's not something that anyone is obligated to do. But this was virtually looked over as just a fluke, just Rowan being greedy or something along those lines. Now, it's important to mention that Hannah had been 14 weeks pregnant with the couple's first child when they'd gotten married. And they'd go on to have their first child on April 10th in 2013, a little girl that they named Alea. And it was a short 2 years after this, on March 19th, 2015, that the couple welcomed their second daughter into the world, a little girl who they named Leanna. And just 1 year after that, the couple would go on to have their third child together. This time, though, it was a boy who they named Trey. And Trey was born on December 4th, 2016. And these kids are the most adorable little babies that you've ever seen. Like, baby magazine cover cute. Now, I did want to go ahead and mention and list the kids and when they were born, just to kind of get that out of the way, and we'll be doing a little bit of jumping around in this case, so just bear with me. But it was the same year that Rowan and Hannah had their second daughter that they decided to finally take the leap, and Rowan and Hannah finally turned their mutual love of fitness into a profit. And they decided that they would open a gym together. Both Rowan and Hannah shared a love of fitness, so this seemed perfect. Hannah quit her retail job, and Rowan quit his job as a pharmaceutical sales rep. And the young couple decided to chase their dreams and to try to turn their love of fitness into a way to provide for their family. But sadly, this gym did not end up being as successful as the couple had hoped for. The gym was only open from 2015 to 2019 before it had to be closed down for good. And there had only ever been 2 investors that helped with the startup of Hannah and Rowan's gym, and those 2 investors were Hannah's parents and one other unknown investor. But since the gym wasn't as successful as everyone would have hoped, Hannah's parents would oftentimes cover the bills for the gym that the couple couldn't afford to pay because they weren't making a profit on the gym like they'd thought. And Hannah and Rowan even tried relocating the gym a few times in hopes that maybe it was just the location, but the location wasn't the reason the gym wasn't making money. The problem was Rowan. Rowan did the personal training side of the gym, and he was known for berating his clients and then forcing them day after day to push themselves to his high standards, oftentimes ending with his clients either in tears or puking their guts up. Rowan would talk shit to these clients to their face, and then he would even talk shit about those same clients to his wife Hannah. And something that really pissed me off when I read it is that Rowan would complain that Hannah had gotten fat after giving birth to each of their 3 kids. And let me just be so clear right now, Hannah was never even close to overweight, even when she was pregnant all 3 times. But it seemed that after Hannah had given birth to their first daughter, things were pretty normal. Hannah's parents and brother were always involved in family dinners and celebrations, and Hannah's mom, Sue, was the only person that Rowan felt like he could trust to watch their only daughter at the time. But it was after Hannah gave birth to the couple's second daughter that things within their relationship started to change. And I'm not just talking about within the dynamic of Hannah and Rowan's relationship, but also the relationship that the couple shared with Hannah's parents, Sue and Lloyd. But Hannah's brother Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed to be one of the few people that could see right through Rowan's facade. Nathaniel had a job where his schedule was like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or maybe 2 weeks on and 1 week off, but however the schedule was, Hannah's brother Nathaniel had been letting Hannah and Rowan borrow his new car while he was on those long work weeks. It was helping Hannah and Rowan out, and it kept Nathaniel's car from just sitting and not being driven. But after Rowan kept returning the car with the gas light on, and after he'd put over 30,000 miles on this car within a super short amount of time, Nathaniel had to tell Rowan that he wasn't going to be able to borrow his car anymore. And Hannah's brother Nathaniel thinks that this was the point where Rowan kind of washed his hands of Nathaniel altogether, but Rowan did at least try to stay friendly with Nathaniel. And Nathaniel believes, and so do I, that Rowan only tried to stay friendly with him so that if he ever needed to use Nathaniel again for anything, that he could still use him if he ever needed to. But over time, because of Rowan, things eventually got so strained between Hannah and Nathaniel that the siblings didn't even speak to each other for over 2 years. It was actually so bad that Nathaniel almost didn't even invite Hannah to his own wedding. Luckily, Hannah and Nathaniel's mom, Sue, were able to talk them into working it out, and Hannah was invited. But then again, there were other things that were also happening within Hannah and Rowan's relationship that wouldn't be known to Hannah's family until it was already at a super dangerous point. Rowan was physically, mentally, emotionally, verbally, sexually, and even financially abusive towards Hannah. But the only signs that her family ever saw at first were just very small red flags. And these red flags that her family did notice were only the ones that Hannah's family would see a small glimpse of. Hannah's mom recalled seeing Rowan push Hannah's leg into a door once when he was upset with her. And then there was another story that Hannah's parents recalled on the podcast called Hannah's Story, which is where most of this research for this episode comes from, which I'll obviously link below. But Hannah's parents remembered how bad Rowan's road rage was. That's hard to say. And they talked about a time that they had all been coming home from dinner together, so it would have been Hannah, Rowan, and both of Hannah's parents in the car together coming home from dinner. And something happened with Rowan and another car on the road, and once this other car came to a stop, Rowan threw his car in park, jumped out, and ran over to the other driver's door screaming that they needed to get out and fight him, and he was even trying to kick their driver door in. Hannah's parents remembered this being a big eye-opening moment for them, and something that maybe a lot of people didn't know, but also something that may have played a big part in Rowan's anger issues, were the fact that he was using steroids as a way to gain muscle mass. And then, just like we've seen time and time again, the isolation started. Rowan seemed to be jealous of Hannah's relationship with her mom, which usually only happens when the abuser is worried about someone else being able to spot the signs of abuse, and them having a fear that that person may be able to point the signs of abuse and manipulation out to the victim. Because Hannah's mom, Sue, was notorious for calling Rowan out on his bullshit, and Rowan hated that about her. But then, Rowan also started dictating what Hannah could and couldn't wear. He claimed that the color pink was for children. So, obviously, for whatever reason, he didn't want Hannah to wear the color pink anymore. But Hannah also wasn't allowed to wear shorts that Rowan disapproved of. And Hannah's parents also noticed that she was more conservative on public beaches. And when Hannah's mom, Sue, asked Hannah about it, Hannah just kind of said that Rowan didn't like her wearing a bikini without having a cover-up to go over her swimsuit. So Hannah stopped wearing the color pink because obviously it's only for children. And did you hear my eyes rolling? Because they did. But she also stopped wearing shorts and a bikini without cover-ups and whatever else Rowan didn't like. Rowan also made Hannah delete her Facebook account because she was obviously not allowed to have a Facebook account of her own. But she was for sure allowed to have a joint Facebook account with Rowan. And this was just another form of isolation. He could control who she spoke to and interacted with on Facebook, and that's exactly what he wanted. And this is actually coming from somebody who has a joint Facebook account. My husband and I both share a Facebook account for 3 different reasons. None of them having to do with trust. For one, we run an entire HVAC company advertisement from that Facebook account. For 2, I also run my podcast Facebook from that joint Facebook account. And thirdly, because neither of us actually use Facebook for any other reason. We have separate Instagram accounts, Twitter accounts, TikTok accounts. Everything else is separate besides our Facebook because we run 2 businesses off of there. But that wasn't the case for Hannah and Rowan. But forcing Hannah to delete her own Facebook page and making it so that she only has one Facebook, if it was a joint Facebook account that Rowan has access to, that was just another way for Rowan to cut off all communication with anyone who may be able to point out the abusive behavior to Hannah. And a perfect example of that was with Hannah's best friend, Nikki. Nikki wasn't afraid to challenge Rowan, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind to Hannah about Rowan. And she also didn't mind speaking her mind about Rowan to Hannah when Rowan was around, and Rowan hated that about Nikki. And then gradually, as they do, things got worse over time. Rowan started calling people that attended the gym that he and Hannah owned, and he would ask them who Hannah had talked to or what she had been doing, and Hannah was only allowed to work with certain clients at the gym who Rowan approved of. She wasn't allowed to work with anyone at the gym that wasn't approved by Rowan, even though they owned the gym and that was literally her whole last job, was to work with people to help train them on workout routines or coaching them through workouts as their personal trainer. Rowan would also question the couple's kids about where mommy had taken them or who mommy had talked to or what mommy had said about him, and that's just super unhealthy. Can we just start normalizing keeping kids out of adult conversations and situations? Because that is insane. And Rowan got more aggressive with Hannah over time too. But he didn't just question the kids about Hannah's whereabouts and who she had spoken to out in public or what she had done. He would also tell Hannah in front of her kids how bad of a wife and a mom she was. He would say that Hannah wasn't a good homemaker, and that she didn't know how to cook or clean or anything else that a housewife and mom should be quote-unquote good at. And even though he bitched and complained about what Hannah did and didn't do around the house, he never offered to help Hannah cook or clean up. And the only time that he would do anything productive around the house is when he would go into this rage-filled cleaning frenzy and just start throwing everybody's stuff away. It was so bad that Hannah's parents even recall one Christmas where the kids were all opening gifts and Rowan got up to pick some wrapping paper up out of the floor to throw it away. And one of the kids started crying and begging Rowan not to throw their new Christmas toys away. Because that was the only time that the kids ever saw Rowan do anything around the house, is when he would pick up anything sitting around the house and throw it away, even the kids' toys. And I feel like it's pretty telling that the kids were freaking out because he picked up a few pieces of wrapping paper, and automatically the kids' first thought was, oh no, Dad's gonna throw our brand new Christmas gifts away. But that's the only time that they ever saw their dad pick up anything around the house is when he was rage cleaning. So that makes sense. Rowan would also use the kids as a weapon though, because Hannah's mom Sue got the kids every Friday, I believe. It may have been every Saturday, but Hannah's mom would get the kids one weekend day every week. And if Hannah did something that Rowan didn't approve of, and Hannah's mom Sue was supposed to be getting the kids that day, he would tell Hannah that the kids couldn't go to her mom's house now. And he would do this because he knew it would hurt not only Hannah, but Hannah's mom and even the kids. And this was usually his end goal. He was pretty controlling. And when Rowan would decide that the kids couldn't go to Hannah's mom's house, he would tell them that it was because Hannah misbehaved. That's why they couldn't go. And he says this almost like Hannah is a 2-year-old and he's teaching her a lesson. Like, hey, the kids can't come over this weekend because Hannah misbehaved. It's important to remember that Hannah was only 20 years old when she met Rowan though, so she likely didn't have a good understanding of how a healthy relationship was supposed to look. Sure, she knew what her parents' relationship looked like, but she didn't have many relationships of her own to compare her marriage and relationship with Rowan too. So it's hard to realize that something isn't normal if that's all you've ever known. And it's made pretty clear that for a long time, Hannah maybe did think that this relationship was normal, because Rowan would do things like go through her phone to see who she was calling or texting. He would go through her purse and her things to see if she was hiding stuff from him. And once when he saw that Hannah had texted someone that he didn't approve of, he threw Hannah's phone across the room and shattered it. And then this is when things eventually got so bad financially at the gym that Hannah's parents had to remortgage their house just to try to keep the gym afloat. And Hannah's parents say that Hannah eventually had to open up a bank account that Rowan didn't know about, just so that she could squirrel away enough money to keep their bills paid at home. And things just kept getting worse from here. Hannah and Rowan were really close with a guy from the gym named Dave. And Dave was kind of like an uncle figure to Hannah and Rowan's 3 kids. But Hannah and Dave really bonded over their love of CrossFit, and it was never anything more than just a platonic friendship. But Hannah and Dave had joined a team of 4 in a CrossFit competition. But Rowan had been trying to qualify for a solo part in the same competition, except he wasn't accepted. So instead of just letting Hannah participate in the competition, Rowan weaseled his way onto the team that Hannah and Dave were on. Now, no one really wanted Rowan on their team because they all knew how Rowan was. But they also didn't want to voice their opinions because they knew that Hannah would likely have to just drop out of the competition altogether to keep the peace. So instead, everyone on the team just dealt with Rowan, constantly berating them and talking down to them and telling them how they could improve even though Rowan didn't qualify and everyone on Hannah and Dave's team did qualify. Now, sometime before the competition was set to start, Hannah was in her car taking one of the team members home, and Hannah was apologizing to this teammate about how Rowan had treated them. And meanwhile, in the backseat of the car, one of Hannah's kids had her phone and they were playing on it. So when Hannah got home with the kids, Rowan claimed that their daughter had accidentally recorded Hannah apologizing to their teammate, and that somehow their daughter had also managed to not only record this conversation, but to also send the recording of Hannah apologizing on Rowan's behalf to Rowan's phone from Hannah's. I do not believe this. And he completely lost his mind on Hannah. Rowan got so pissed that Hannah had quote-unquote disrespected him by apologizing for his shit attitude that he decided that he wasn't going to participate in this competition anymore. And Rowan did this because he thought that the entire team would have to forfeit if he didn't participate. But luckily, Hannah's team managed to find someone else to take Rowan's place so that they could still participate. But then the morning of the competition, Hannah got up and went to the gym, and when she got home, Rowan and all 3 of their kids were gone from the house. Rowan hadn't mentioned taking the kids anywhere, and he hadn't called or texted to let her know that they wouldn't be home. So Hannah tried calling and texting Rowan, but he wasn't responding or answering any of her calls. So of course, Hannah starts to kind of panic because she knows Rowan. She knows that he's unhinged. So Hannah called her mom and her brother to get them to come over and to help her figure out what she needed to do from here. And it was well after lunchtime when Rowan finally called Hannah to let her know that he would bring the kids home when he felt like it, and he told Hannah that this was all her fault. This all could have been avoided. But then Rowan said something that kind of made a light bulb go off, not only in Hannah's mind, but also in her mom's mind. Rowan told Hannah that he couldn't believe that she'd called her mom and brother to come over just because he'd taken the kids. But Hannah hadn't told Rowan that she'd called her mom and brother to come over. So how did he even know that? And Hannah started kind of connecting the dots once he said this. She fully believed that Rowan had a listening device on her phone, and possibly even a listening device inside of their house and cars, which would also explain how Rowan even knew about Hannah apologizing to the teammate about Rowan's behavior. Because Hannah never could find that recording that was supposedly recorded and sent to Rowan's phone by their daughter. He was listening to everything that she said to anyone that she talked to, and now Hannah was sure of it. So now Rowan is in the wind with all 3 of their kids simply because Hannah wouldn't pull out of this competition. So Hannah told her mom that she was just going to pull out, that she wasn't going to compete, and that she was just going to drop it so that Rowan would bring the kids back home. And Hannah's mom was like, no, that's exactly what he wants you to do. You've worked really hard to get here and you deserve to compete. And her mom was right. Hannah had been training and working her ass off to compete in this competition. And after the pep talk and a hug from her mom, Hannah's mom was finally able to talk Hannah into going ahead and going to the competition and finishing what she'd started. So that's exactly what Hannah did. She went to the competition and she kicked ass, and you'll never guess who showed up with the kids pretending like he was so proud of his wife and all of her hard work. Yeah, after all of that, Rowan showed up and acted like nothing had even happened. He even posted pictures on their joint Facebook account, saying how proud he was of Hannah and saying how hard she'd worked to get here, and just all the things that a good husband would say about their wife when they've accomplished something that they've been working on. But this was kind of the final straw for Hannah. She knew that she needed to get herself and her kids away from Rowan. So Hannah asked her parents if they could get their house ready for her and the kids if she decided to leave Rowan. But Hannah's parents had always had their house ready for Hannah and the kids to come and live with them if and when Hannah ever decided to leave Rowan. Because after Hannah had given birth to the couple's second daughter, she had been planning to leave shortly after she'd given birth. But before she was able to leave and figure out a plan, Hannah found out she was pregnant with their third child, which was their son. And once Hannah found out that their third baby was going to be a boy, she said that she knew that Rowan wouldn't just let her leave with his first and only son. Which is weird because he does have a kid from a previous marriage, which I'm pretty sure was a boy. But anyway, she stayed and she tried to make it work, even after finding out she was pregnant with their third baby. But after this little stunt of taking the kids and then showing up at the competition like everything was fine, Hannah put her escape plan into place. She let her parents know that they could start getting the house ready for her and the kids, and Hannah even reached out to a women's shelter to get tips and advice on how to leave Rowan as safely as possible. The women's shelter told Hannah to start putting small amounts of money up and to start getting her important paperwork together and to get it out of the house before she ever tried to leave. So Hannah got the kids' birth certificates, her banking information, insurance information, stuff like that. She was able to get that out of the house without Rowan noticing, before she'd ever planned to leave. And on December 5th, 2019, Hannah woke up and went to the gym where her best friend Nikki was there waiting on her. Nikki went with Hannah to the house that she and Rowan shared, and Nikki helped to pack things up and get them loaded. Hannah told the kids that they could pick out 2 of their favorite toys to take with them, and that would be all they would be allowed to take besides clothes. Hannah had learned from the women's shelter that she needed to take the bare necessities and to get out before Rowan realized what was happening, which is actually really good advice for anyone looking to get out of an abusive relationship. And it's kind of crazy because Hannah's oldest daughter, Aaliyah, was only 6 years old at the time that Hannah decided to leave Rowan for good. And when Hannah picked Aaliyah up from school that day and Hannah told her that they were moving out, 6-year-old Aaliyah just replied with, "Oh, good." So even Hannah's 6-year-old knew that this was a pretty bad situation, which I think just kind of speaks for itself with how Hannah and the kids were having to live with Rowan. But back at the house, Hannah only took 2 garbage bags full of clothes, along with the 2 toys that she'd let each of her 3 kids pick out. So 2 garbage bags for an adult and 3 kids. So Hannah didn't take much for herself or the kids. She took the bare necessities just like she was told. Hannah's best friend Nikki followed Hannah to a nearby McDonald's where they left Hannah's car and her cell phone. Hannah had already figured out that Rowan was listening in on her phone conversations, and he most likely had a tracker on her car. So she left both her car and her phone at a local McDonald's. Hannah and her 3 kids ended up spending the night at Hannah's best friend Nikki's house the first night that Hannah and the kids left Rowan. And Hannah had decided to spend the night at Nikki's with the kids the first night because Rowan didn't know exactly where Nikki lived, so Rowan wouldn't be able to find them the first night. And Nikki even kind of threw Hannah like a celebratory party for the first night that Hannah and the kids were away from Rowan for good. And this was going to be a new start for Hannah and the kids. And everybody was excited to see where they'd end up in the future. And of course, the entire first night that Hannah and the kids were gone and staying with Nikki, Rowan was blowing Hannah's phone up with empty promises and please to come back and, please tell me where you are, who are you with. But after the first night away from Rowan, Hannah and the kids stayed with Hannah's parents for the weekend. But eventually, Hannah did answer Rowan's calls and she even agreed to meet with him for a coffee that Sunday. Hannah left the kids with her parents while they met up though. And it seemed like Hannah was just trying to appease Rowan, because when Hannah got back to her parents' house after meeting Rowan for coffee, Rowan came back to her parents' house with her, and when her mom asked if she was okay, Hannah said that she was going to go home with Rowan that night, and that she would be at the gym the next morning so that Rowan wouldn't suspect that she was still planning to leave him. So the next morning on Monday, Hannah went to her brother Nathaniel's house. And when Rowan figured out that Hannah had kind of played him and that she was still planning to leave him, Rowan told Hannah that she was only hurting the kids by leaving, and that the kids would be better off with two parents in one house that were still married, just the whole 9 yards. And as we all know, kids are better off with two separate parents who are happy apart than being in a house where both parents still live together but are miserable. And Hannah was pretty close to going back to Rowan, but luckily her brother was able to talk some sense into her, and she decided to stand her ground. But this is when Hannah finally broke down and let her family in on all of the things that had been going on in her marriage, and she finally let them know how bad things had actually gotten between her and Rowan. And Hannah's brother even recalled that every time Rowan would call Hannah and beg her to come back home, that it was almost like Hannah was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, where people feel some sort of connection and sympathy towards their abuser. He even said that Hannah always had to be talked into not going back to Rowan. Hannah's mom even says that she thinks that it took Hannah a week or two to finally, come out from under Rowan's spell. That it took Hannah some getting used to not be under Rowan's thumb constantly. But eventually, Hannah got to a point where she was done and she was over it and she was ready to leave for good. Hannah, at one point, was even convinced that the only way that she would be able to escape Rowan for good would be for her and the kids to move somewhere far, far away where Rowan didn't know where they were. But Hannah's family were able to convince Hannah just to stay put and to live with her parents until she was stable enough to be on her feet to be able to support herself and the kids without any help from Rowan. So Hannah's family were extremely supportive, and they stood behind her 100% on her decision from the moment that Hannah decided to leave Rowan. And as we all know, the most dangerous time in a domestic violence relationship is when the victim finally decides to leave. So once Hannah left Rowan for good, the gym that the couple owned and ran together eventually closed, with Hannah and Rowan being more than $75,000 in debt. But luckily, Hannah had been able to land another job at a shoe store after the gym closed for good. And Rowan would somehow manage to show up and walk around the store every time Hannah was at work. And it eventually got to a point where Hannah's parents started driving her to and from work just because they were worried about Rowan might try to retaliate against Hannah for not coming back to him like he wanted. But Rowan took it even a step further than that, though, because there are multiple people who claim that Rowan would call them after Hannah left him, and Rowan would try to convince these mutual friends of his and Hannah's to kind of side with him in the separation. You know how when a couple that you're friends with separates and they want a divorce, then you're put in the awkward position to choose which friend you get to stay friends with through the separation? Well, that's what Rowan was doing with all of he and Hannah's mutual friends. Rowan was calling all of these people playing the victim in the relationship and then trying to convince them to be on his side in the separation and the divorce. Which is so weird for me to even think about how these phone calls went, because he was definitely the abuser and most people knew that. Now, Hannah's family weren't really worried about Rowan hurting Hannah at first, but that changed once Rowan actually snuck into Hannah's parents' house one day and took their daughter Liana. So Hannah and her parents had gotten pretty good about locking the doors to the house even when they were home, and they didn't let the kids go outside without an adult. But somehow Rowan had still been able to sneak into the house through an unlocked door and take Liana, even though Hannah and Rowan had already worked out a legal visitation between Rowan and the kids. Rowan absolutely refused to bring Liana back, and Hannah felt like she didn't really have a choice but to go to the police and see what she could do. And when Hannah went to the police about Rowan taking Liana and refusing to bring her back, even with a custody agreement already in place, that led police to take out a DVO, or a domestic violence order, on Rowan. Hannah absolutely did not want to take this domestic violence order out against Rowan because she knew that it could possibly make things worse, but this wasn't Hannah's call to make this time. The police are actually the ones who decided to take a DVO out on Rowan. And during this time at the police station is when another piece of information was learned about the couple's marriage. While the officers were writing up this DVO order against Rowan, Hannah was talking to another female officer. And during this chat with this female officer, Hannah revealed that while she and Rowan were still together, that Rowan would force Hannah to have sex with him every single night. And if Hannah didn't want to have sex or if she didn't feel like it, that didn't matter. Rowan would literally force her. And this case happened in 2020, so spousal rape was acknowledged as a crime by then. Just because you're married to someone doesn't give you free access to their body whenever and however you see fit. You still have to have consent to have sex, even if you're married. And this female officer told Hannah that this was spousal rape. Hannah went on to say that when she was forced to have sex with Rowan every night, if it didn't look like she was enjoying herself, or if she tried to refuse sex, that Rowan would go into like a fit of rage. And after talking with Hannah for a while, the officer was convinced that Hannah was telling the truth, and she even believed that Rowan was using a form of abuse called coercive control against Hannah as well. Coercive control, though, is extremely hard to prove, but the officers were sure that that's what Rowan was doing. And for anyone who's never heard of or read about coercive control before, it's described as an act or a pattern of acts of assaults, threats, humiliation, and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten their victim. And in this case, Hannah would of course be the victim. And this was exactly what Rowan was doing to Hannah, along with nearly every other known form of abuse. So now on top of Rowan being physically, mentally, emotionally, verbally, sexually, and financially abusive towards Hannah, we also learned that she was being spousally raped and coercive control was being used as a way to abuse Hannah too. So once this domestic violence order was put into place, there was also a child custody order put into place. This child custody order stated that Rowan would be allowed to see their kids, but he wasn't allowed to see, be around, or have any contact with Hannah whatsoever. Which, I'm just thinking about it, and I haven't seen or heard anything about Rowan's first kid from his first marriage, so I'm not sure if he even stayed in touch with his first child. Which also kind of validates the fact that I feel like Rowan was just using the kids as a way to hurt Hannah. But if he just forgot all about his first kid, then he probably didn't care to see his third kids that he'd had with Hannah either. But he likely knew that seeing the kids would not only hurt Hannah, but it would also hurt her family. Now, Hannah tried to have it set up where Rowan would get the kids 3 days a week one week, and then the next week he'd get them 4 days a week. And then the 3 and 4 day weeks would just rotate every week, which that basically sounds like 50-50 custody to me. And I think that Rowan would have had the kids a total of like 165 days out of the year if he would have agreed to that. But of course, Rowan wasn't going to agree to anything that made Hannah's life a little bit easier. So instead, Rowan made it clear that he was going for exactly 50-50 custody. He didn't want Hannah to have the kids for one more day a year than what he got with them. And again, I think this is just one more way that he thought he could hurt Hannah. I don't think he actually gave a rat's ass about having the exact same amount of days as Hannah or even seeing his kids. But that's besides the point. So usually when Rowan would pick the kids up and drop them off, Hannah's mom Sue would go outside and deal with Rowan so that Hannah didn't have to. But Rowan was getting more and more unhinged by the day, so Hannah started going into the driveway of her parents' house to meet Rowan to either get the kids back from him or to drop the kids off with him on his days. And one of those times when Hannah was getting their youngest son out of his car seat in the back of Rowan's truck, Hannah saw a folder in the floorboard of Rowan's truck and she could see pictures of herself in that folder. These pictures were of Hannah in her underwear. These were pictures that Rowan had taken of Hannah while the couple were still together, and Hannah of course freaked out and asked him why he even had those in a folder. And Rowan told Hannah that he had planned to turn those pictures over to the courts to prove that Hannah had never been a victim of spousal rape. And as Hannah tried to grab these pictures out of Rowan's truck, Rowan grabbed Hannah's arm and twisted it in a way like he was trying to snap her arm in half. Hannah's mom saw the commotion and went straight out to break up the argument. Now after this, Hannah got back in touch with the police to report the assault. This would have meant that Rowan had broken the domestic violence order, and the police had given Rowan 48 hours to turn himself in. Naturally, that's not what happened. It took Rowan 10 whole ass days to turn himself in, and the only reason he ever turned himself in is because a couple of officers recognized him out in public. Now, after he did turn himself in 10 days later, Rowan's charges were eventually dropped to something lesser than assault, and the breach of his DVO was never even mentioned. Now, after this charge was downgraded, Rowan was given another 48 hours to turn himself in. Sadly, that day would never come. It was February 19th, 2020, that Hannah, her mom Sue, and all three of the kids got up for the morning. Hannah went out to grab coffees, and her mom Sue went to the gym for her morning workout. Now, afterwards, Hannah and her mom are back at Hannah's parents' house getting the kids ready for school and daycare and feeding the kids breakfast. Just a very normal day in the life of a mom and grandma of 3 small kids. Hannah's dad had left for work super early that morning at like 4:30 or somewhere close to that, and after feeding the kids and getting them ready for the day, Hannah's mom Sue kissed the kids and Hannah, and she left the house to start her day. Shortly after this, Hannah and all 3 of the kids walked into the driveway of Hannah's parents' house, and Hannah loaded and buckled up all 3 of the kids into the backseat of her car. From here, Hannah and the kids were completely ambushed. Rowan had been sitting across the street from Hannah's parents' house, watching Hannah strap their 3 kids into the car that morning. So, what had Rowan been doing the morning of February 18th, 2020? Well, for starters, he'd driven to a gas station that was about 10 minutes from his house and filled up a gas can. Afterwards, he'd headed to a coffee shop where he sat outside of the cafe drinking a cup of coffee for about an hour. From here, Rowan drove to Hannah's parents' house and he sat, parked across the street, just lurking and waiting. And then at about 8:15 a.m., Rowan saw Hannah and the kids walk out of the door of her parents' house, and he watched as she strapped all 3 of their kids into the back seat. Rowan calmly grabbed a gas can that he'd filled up earlier that morning, and he walked across the street to the passenger side of Hannah's car. Rowan had a knife and a gas can, and he told Hannah to drive. Hannah can obviously see that something is very much wrong, but she backs her Kia out of the driveway and she drives. Hannah's driving slowly as she turns onto Raven Street. Once she was on Raven Street, Hannah is driving pretty slow, and she spots a man outside in his yard. And she already had one of her car windows down before Rowan jumped into her car that morning, so Hannah stopped the car and yelled at the man in his yard. Hannah screamed at this man, telling him that she needed help and screaming that Rowan had covered them all in petrol, which in Australia, that's what they call gas. So Hannah parks the car and there are 2 men outside. They see Rowan had both of his arms around Hannah, and Hannah's yelling over and over and over, begging these men to help her and her kids. She's screaming, telling them that Rowan is trying to kill them. One of the men walk over and try to open the car door to pull Hannah out. And this is when he saw Rowan flick a lighter. And this was immediately after Hannah had just yelled, telling these men that Rowan had covered them all in gasoline. The man that had been trying to help Hannah out of her car was flung backwards as the car exploded. That man didn't realize that there were 3 kids in the back seat of this car, though. He thought it was just Hannah and Rowan. People who were nearby said that you could feel the vibrations from the explosions more than 10 meters away. The explosion did finally cause Hannah's car door to open, though, and she was able to climb out of the car. There were 2 other men who were standing nearby working when the explosion happened, and they ran over and they were able to pull Rowan out of the car, because Hannah had managed to get herself out, and these 2 random men who had been working nearby, they had no idea that Rowan had been the one to cause this entire scene to unfold. The man who had been working in his yard, he dragged the water hose over and started to spray Hannah and Rowan off with water. None of these people who were trying to help knew that there were 3 kids in the backseat of Hannah's car. And none of them knew that Rowan had been the cause of this entire thing. The man with the water hose recalled spraying Rowan down and looking into his eyes and seeing nothing but blackness. So that's when the man decided that he'd use the one water resource that he had on Hannah instead. All of these men who were trying to help also suffered at least some kind of burns to their body. And finally, someone was able to call 000, which is Australia's 911 number. And once somebody was on the phone with police, that's when all of the men who had been trying to help Hannah heard her screaming that her children were in the car. And as one of the men walked over to the car and he saw the children in the back seat, he described seeing that scene by saying that he thinks his soul left his body. The car was engulfed in flames, and there was no way that anyone could even attempt to get close enough to the car to try to pull these kids out. Now, to everybody's surprise, though, Rowan, who had burns to over 80% of his body, he dives back into the car that's still engulfed in flames, and he emerges a few seconds later. And if you were hoping that Rowan was diving back into a burning car to try to save his children, you would be wrong. Rowan had actually jumped back into the car and grabbed the knife that he'd brought with him. Rowan sat down on his knees and held the knife out away from his body just a little ways before he slung his body towards the knife 3 different times. He stabbed himself twice in the stomach area and once in the chest. Fire trucks, ambulance, and police sirens could be heard coming from a distance away. And the fire truck that arrived on scene first had started working on putting the fire out. Everybody who was at the scene of this crime all remember that Hannah's only concerns were that somebody get her babies out of the car. She even told a paramedic at one point after they'd arrived that she should have never gotten out of the car, that she should have stayed in the car with her kids. Hannah was the very definition of a mother, even up until the very end. Now, paramedics arrived shortly after the fire department did, and they started working on Hannah immediately. Hannah was still alive at this point, and even though more than 99% of her body was covered in fatal burns, she was still able to tell paramedics every single thing that had happened that morning. The only part of Hannah's body that wasn't covered in burns were the bottoms of her feet. Now, other paramedics were there on the scene too, treating Rowan. He went into cardiac arrest during the ride to the hospital, and paramedics ended up doing legit open-heart surgery in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Paramedics were able to get everything back in place and fixed, but they couldn't get his heart to start pumping again. He was pronounced dead at 9:14 a.m., with his cause of death listed as self-inflicted wounds to his chest. Hannah was intubated and anesthetized on the way to the hospital, and all 3 of Hannah's children were pronounced dead on the scene, obviously with their cause of death being listed as being burned. This makes my stomach hurt so bad. I'm really sorry, y'all. I don't even know what I was thinking covering this. Let's get through it, though. We're almost there, because someone out there needs to hear this. We're almost done, though. Hannah's mom, Sue, had been hearing sirens going off all morning while she'd been at work, and eventually a coworker informed Sue that 3 children had been burned to death, and Sue's heart knew that it was her grandchildren as soon as this coworker told Sue that it had happened on Raven Street in Camp Hill. And as soon as Sue looked up, she saw officers walking towards her to tell her everything that had just happened. Meanwhile, Hannah's dad, Lloyd, was also at work when he'd heard rumblings of something happening on Raven Street. He tried calling his wife, Sue, over and over again, but Sue was trying to avoid answering the phone because officers were driving Sue to where Lloyd worked so that she could tell him in person. But she eventually did break down and answer her husband's calls, and she had to tell her husband over the phone that all 3 of their grandchildren had been murdered and that Hannah likely wouldn't make it, all because of Rowan Baxter. Sue had also called Hannah's brother Nathaniel to tell him that he needed to meet them at the hospital immediately, describing the basics of what had taken place. And then the call to Hannah's best friend Nikki was made. Hannah had her mom, her dad, her brother, her sister-in-law, and her best friend all by her side as the life support machine was unhooked. Hannah's best friend Nikki had gone to get up off of the floor and to let the family unhook Hannah alone and say their goodbyes, and Hannah's mom told her absolutely not. Sue told Nikki that she was just as much Hannah's family as the rest of them, and Nikki was able to hold Hannah's hand as the machine was unhooked and Hannah took her last breaths. It was at 5:40 p.m. on February 19th, 2020 that Hannah was pronounced dead. Hannah's mom recalled telling Hannah to go on ahead and be with her babies as they unhooked the machine and Hannah passed away. It was almost 3 weeks later when the funeral services were held for 31-year-old Hannah, 6-year-old Aaliyah, 4-year-old Liana, and 3-year-old Trey. Hannah and all 3 of her kids were put into one single white coffin, and all of Hannah's family talked about how great of a mom she was and how impressive and loved all 3 of her kids were during the funeral services. It was an extremely tear-jerking speech that everyone gave, saying their goodbyes during the services, so much so that there was no way I'd get through reading that without crying. It was later revealed during the investigation that Rowan had actually made a few comments to the barista at the coffee shop that morning. Rowan had mentioned that he was fighting with his ex-wife and how annoying it was. Then he made a comment about the Google Maps app on his phone. So we'll never know if Rowan was planning to leave after he'd murdered his wife and 3 kids, or if he was possibly tracking Hannah's movements beforehand to know exactly where she would be. It was also later discovered that Rowan could be seen on CCTV cameras prior to February 18th, buying zip ties, a gas can, and cleaning solution. He also bought 3 of those small chocolate Kinder Egg candies. They're just really small egg-shaped chocolates with a tiny toy on one side of the egg and chocolate on the other side. Which I'm like, what was the point in buying the 3 chocolate eggs? He knew full well what he was planning to do. And then I've been thinking about it, and could you even imagine being these guys that were just randomly outside in their yard, doing regular day-to-day stuff, and then having to watch this scene unfold in front of you? They are for sure the kind of heroes without capes. And I'm sure this scene will stay with them, and it's something that they'll never forget. Now, what makes this case even sadder than it already is the fact that just days before Hannah and all 3 of her young kids were murdered, Hannah had actually asked her mom Sue to help her create a will because Hannah very much felt like her life was in danger. Hannah never imagined that Rowan would physically hurt the kids, but she knew that she wasn't safe. And what makes it even worse than that is when the autopsies were done on Hannah and all 3 of her kids, it was confirmed that all of Hannah's clothes and all of the kids' clothes had been doused in gasoline, but Rowan's clothes didn't have a single drop of gas on them. And obviously we know what the autopsy listed as everyone's cause of death. All of the kids and Hannah's deaths were listed as homicide. And the police believe that Rowan had planned to make Hannah drive the car somewhere more secluded, but that she screwed his plan up when she stopped the car and was able to yell for help. Police also aren't sure if Rowan actually planned to kill his children or himself, and they think that it's possible that Rowan decided to take the lives of his kids and himself once Hannah put up a fight and his plan was ruined. None of Hannah's family or friends ever believed that the kids were in danger with Rowan, even though they all knew that Rowan would hurt Hannah if he was given the chance. Now, after Hannah and the kids' death, Hannah's family started the Small Steps for Hannah Foundation, which the Clarke family runs to educate children and support victims and the families to take small steps, but vital steps, to halt the cycle of domestic violence and support those affected by it in and around Australia. And I'll also leave the link to the Small Steps for Hannah website down below, and also the link to the Hannah Story podcast, because if you want all the details about this case, that's the perfect place to go listen. This story is told by Hannah's family, in their own words, where they share a lot of experiences with Rowan, and they also shed a good bit of light on small things to look for if someone you love may be in a domestic violence situation. And I think that is all I have for you this week. This was rough. I am so sorry. I did not even realize what I was doing to myself with this one. So I'm going to see if we have a new review of the week. Maybe we can find something to smile at before we sign off. So this review comes from Apple Podcast. It's 5 stars, and the subject line says, "Love it." The review says, "I follow you on TikTok and have never listened to one of your podcasts. Recently, my daughter convinced me to listen while I was at work, and I absolutely love it. You tell a story better than anyone else. My daughter has given me other podcasts to listen to because I'm a true crime person, but none of them tell the story the way you do. So for me, it will always be Mama Murdered a Podcast." That review comes from Tommy Bunch, and I love that so much. Thank you so much. So it is time for me to go. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.